Richard held her tightly, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. He looked up at Elaine, who stood in the doorway, watching them with a mixture of guilt and regret. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this for her." Richard didn't respond. He didn't have the words. As night fell, the tension in the cabin only grew. Rachel was outside, securing the perimeter, while Richard sat with Zoe, trying to calm her fears. But his mind was elsewhere, racing with thoughts of what Elaine had told them. They were running from something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined, an organization that controlled everything from the shadows. And now they wanted Zoe, not because of who she was, but because of who Elaine was. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from outside. Richard's heart leaped into his throat as he rushed to the window, peering into the darkness. Rachel burst through the door, her gun drawn. "We have company." Before Richard could react, the cabin door was kicked open, and a group of masked men stormed in, their guns trained on Richard, Elaine, and Zoe. "Don't move," one of them growled, his voice low and menacing. "We're here for the girl." Richard's blood turned to ice as he stood frozen in place, his eyes locked on the barrel of the gun, pointed at his chest. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's just a child." But the men didn't care. They were here for Zoe, and they wouldn't leave without her. The next few moments unfolded in a blur of chaos. Rachel lunged at the men, gunfire erupting as she fought to protect Zoe. Richard grabbed Zoe, pulling her behind him as he tried. The cabin erupted into chaos. Richard's heart raced as he shielded Zoe behind him, his mind racing with thoughts of how to protect her. The masked men surged forward, shouting orders and brandishing weapons as Rachel exchanged fire with them, her training evident in the way she maneuvered. "Get down!" Richard shouted, pushing Zoe to the ground behind a wooden table, the only cover they had. He could hear the bullets whizzing past him, the shattering of wood as they struck the walls and furniture around them. "Richard, we need to move," Rachel shouted, taking a brief moment to reload her weapon. She had managed to take down one of the men, but the others were still advancing. "Where do we go?" Richard yelled, his mind racing. The cabin was small, and there was no back door to escape through. They were trapped. "There's a basement," Elaine shouted from the corner of the room, fear etched on her face. "We can hide there." Richard hesitated, glancing at Zoe, whose eyes were wide with terror. "Can you run?" he asked her, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. Zoe nodded, her expression resolute. "I can, Daddy." "Okay," he said, steeling himself. "On my count, we're going to run for that door. I'll cover you. Just keep moving, don't stop." "Got it," Rachel confirmed, her focus unwavering as she aimed at the advancing men. 1, 2, 3. Richard shouted, his heart pounding as he sprinted toward the basement door with Zoe in tow. He could hear the shouts and the thudding of boots behind them as he threw the door open and pushed Zoe inside, then turned to face the oncoming danger. "Go!" he yelled at Rachel, who took one last shot before darting through the door. Richard slammed the door behind them just as a bullet grazed his shoulder. He hissed in pain, but pushed through the adrenaline coursing through him. The basement was dark and musty, a stark contrast to the chaos above. Richard flicked on his phone's flashlight, illuminating the room. It was filled with old furniture, crates, and cobwebs, a relic of a forgotten time. "Stay close to me, Zoe," Richard instructed, his voice firm but gentle. He could feel his heart racing, both from the physical exertion and the fear for his daughter's safety. "Is it safe here, Daddy?" Zoe asked, her voice trembling as she clutched his hand tightly. "For now," he replied, trying to mask the uncertainty in his voice. "But we need to be quiet and still." Rachel crouched down beside them, her gun at the ready. "We'll wait it out here. They'll probably search the cabin, but they won't expect us to be in the basement." The sound of shouting and chaos echoed from above, the men searching for them. Richard could hear them tearing through the cabin, throwing furniture aside and calling out for Zoe. The more they shouted, the more Richard's heart sank. Each passing moment was a reminder of how dire their situation was. "Elaine," Rachel said quietly, looking at the woman who had led them into this nightmare. "What do they want with Zoe? Why is she so important?" Elaine's expression darkened. "They want her as leverage against me. When I left them, I took something they wanted, a package that contained information on their dealings. They want to make me pay, and Zoe is the only way they can hurt me." Richard felt a surge of anger. "You put her in danger, Elaine. All of this is because of you. I didn't know they would come after her." Elaine shouted, tears brimming in her eyes. "I thought I could keep her safe." Zoe's grip on Richard's hand tightened as she looked between the adults, fear radiating off her small frame. "Daddy, I'm scared." "I know, sweetheart. I know," Richard said softly, brushing his hand through her hair. "But I promise you, I won't let anything happen to you. We're going to get out of this." Suddenly, the sounds from above grew louder. One of men was approaching basement door. Richard held his breath, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He glanced at Rachel, whose face was set in grim determination, ready for whatever came next. "Keep Zoe behind you," Rachel whispered, her eyes fixed on the door. Richard nodded, positioning Zoe directly behind him as the man reached for the door handle. "Please don't." Zoe whimpered, her small voice barely a whisper. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark outline of a figure silhouetted against the faint light from the cabin. Richard's heart raced as the man stepped inside, scanning the room. Just as he took a step forward, Rachel acted. She surged forward, gun raised, her instincts honed from years of training. "Freeze!" she shouted, pulling the trigger. The bullet struck the man squarely in the shoulder, and he stumbled back, dropping his weapon. "Run!" Rachel shouted as the commotion above intensified. Richard didn't have to be told twice. He grabbed Zoe's hand, pulling her close as they darted past the fallen man, racing toward the stairs that led back up to the cabin. "Where do we go?" Zoe cried, her eyes wide with panic. "We'll find another way out," Richard assured her, his voice steadier than he felt. "Just keep moving." As they rushed up the stairs, Richard's mind raced with thoughts of escape. They had to get out of the cabin, away from the men who were hunting them. He couldn't let them take Zoe, he wouldn't. But as they reached the top of the stairs, the cabin door burst open again, and another group of men stormed in, guns drawn. Richard felt his heart drop. There was nowhere to go. "Get down!" Rachel yelled, pushing Zoe and Richard to the ground just as gunfire erupted in the cabin. The world exploded around them as the cabin shook from the impacts of bullets hitting the walls and furniture. Richard's instinct kicked in. He pulled Zoe closer to him, covering her body with his own as they lay on the floor, praying for a miracle. The sounds of chaos filled the air, shouts, gunfire, and the unmistakable sound of a struggle as Rachel engaged with the men. Richard could hear her yelling orders, commanding them to move back, but the intensity of the situation made it impossible to gauge how many were out there. "Stay down," Richard whispered to Zoe, who was trembling beneath him. "No matter what happens, don't move." He could see the fear in her eyes, and it broke his heart. He wished he could take her away from all of this, away from the danger that loomed like a dark cloud over their lives. But for now, they had to survive. Suddenly, a loud crash sounded from the back of the cabin, and Richard's heart raced as he realized one of the men had broken through a window. "They're in!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet and pulling Zoe with him. "Get back!" Rachel shouted, her voice firm as she pushed against one of the men trying to enter the room. "We can't let them get in." Richard's instincts kicked in, and he grabbed a heavy wooden chair, swinging it at the nearest man, who was still trying to make his way through the window. The chair connected with a loud crack, sending the man tumbling backward. "Come on!" Richard yelled, pulling Zoe toward the back of the cabin, where he hoped they could find another exit. But as they moved, Richard felt a sharp pain slice through his arm. He turned to see another masked man standing behind him, a knife glinting in the dim light. "Don't move," the man growled, advancing slowly. Richard's heart raced as he pushed Zoe behind him again, preparing to defend her at all costs. Just as the man lunged forward, Rachel fired another shot, hitting the man in the leg. He fell to the ground, cursing as he clutched his injury. "Richard, go!" Rachel shouted, her voice full of urgency. "Get Zoe out of here." Without thinking, Richard grabbed Zoe's hand, pulling her toward the back of the cabin, where a door led out to the woods. But before they could reach it, more men surged into the room, filling the space like a wave of darkness. "Richard!" Rachel yelled, her voice filled with desperation. "I can't hold them off much longer." Richard felt a surge of panic. They couldn't stay here. There was no way they could fight off this many men. But where could they go? "Zoe, keep your head down," he instructed, his heart racing. He could hear the chaos behind them, the sounds of gunfire and shouts growing louder. "Daddy, I'm scared," Zoe cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. I know, he said, squeezing her hand tightly. "Just trust me." They reached the back door, but as Richard turned the handle, he felt it jammed shut. "It's locked," he yelled, frustration boiling within him. "Break it down," Rachel shouted from behind them, firing at the men who were closing in. With every ounce of strength he had left, Richard slammed his shoulder into the door, feeling the wood give slightly. But it wasn't enough. He couldn't let them get caught, couldn't let them take Zoe. "Try again," Rachel yelled, her voice echoing in the chaos. Richard threw himself against the door once more, this time with more force. The door rattled, but remained closed. Panic threatened to swallow him whole. He could feel the heat of danger rising behind him, the sounds of struggle growing closer. "Get ready, Zoe," he yelled, bracing himself for one last attempt. On 3. 1, 2, 3. He hurled himself against the door with all his might, and with a deafening crack, it burst open, sending him tumbling into the darkness beyond. They stumbled out into the thick brush of the forest surrounding the cabin, the night air cool against Richard's skin. He took a moment to regain his bearings, pulling Zoe closer to him as they began to run. "Where do we go?" Zoe asked, her voice shaking. "Anywhere but here," Richard replied, his breath heavy as they plunged deeper into the woods. The darkness enveloped them, and the sounds of chaos faded behind them, but Richard's heart raced with fear. They were still in danger, and he had no idea how far the men would pursue them. "Stay close," he instructed, gripping her hand tightly as they maneuvered through the trees, branches scratching at their skin as they raced forward. Richard's mind raced with thoughts of how to keep Zoe safe. He needed a plan and escape route that would lead them far away from this nightmare. Just then, Richard heard voices in the distance shouting angry curses as the men regrouped and began their search. "They're coming," he hissed, urging Zoe to move faster. "Daddy, I can't," she cried, stumbling over a root as they ran. "Just a little further," he urged, his heart pounding in his chest. "We'll find a place to hide." They pushed deeper into the forest, the moonlight barely filtering through the dense trees. The sounds of their pursuers grew louder, their shouts echoing in the night. Richard felt the weight of despair settling over him. How long could they keep running? How long before they were caught? Finally, they stumbled upon a small clearing, overgrown with bushes and trees. Richard glanced around, searching for a place to hide. He spotted a thick patch of ferns and gestured for Zoe to follow him. "Get in there," he whispered urgently, shoving her gently into the underbrush. "Stay low and quiet." As Zoe crouched down, Richard peeked out from behind the ferns, watching as the men entered the clearing. They were shouting angrily, searching the area with flashlights, their faces obscured by the darkness. "Where did they go?" one of the men growled, scanning the surroundings. "I don't know, but we can't let them escape," another man replied, his voice laced with frustration. "Split up and search the area. They can't be far." Richard felt his stomach drop as he realized the hunt was intensifying. They had to stay hidden, had to remain silent as the men began their search. As the men fanned out, Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel Zoe's small body trembling beside him, her fear palpable in the stillness of the night. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't be discovered. "Daddy," Zoe whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if they find us?" "They won't," Richard replied, trying to reassure her, even as uncertainty gripped him. "Just stay quiet, okay? We'll be safe." He could see the men moving closer, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the trees around them. Richard's heart raced as one of the men paused just a few feet away, the beam of light scanning the ground. "Check over there," the man called to his companions, pointing toward the ferns. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he realized they were dangerously close to being found. "Stay still," he whispered urgently to Zoe, his voice steady despite the fear threatening to overwhelm him. The man moved closer, and Richard could see the glint of his weapon as he crouched down, searching the area. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he held Zoe tightly, willing her to remain quiet. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the woods as one of the other men tripped over a fallen branch, sending him sprawling to the ground. The noise drew the attention of the man nearby, who turned his flashlight toward the sound. "What was that?" he shouted, moving toward the commotion. Richard felt a surge of panic as the other men converged on the noise. This was their chance. He grabbed Zoe's hand, his heart racing as they made a break for it, darting from their hiding place and running deeper into the woods. "Daddy, wait!" Zoe cried, her small feet struggling to keep up with his frantic pace. Just keep going, he urged, determination fueling his every step. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to escaping. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the sounds of their pursuers faded behind them. Richard felt a flicker of hope ignite in his chest. Maybe they could make it, maybe they could escape this nightmare. But just as he began to feel a sense of relief, he heard shouting in the distance again. They went this way. A voice called out, echoing through the trees. Quick, we need to find somewhere to hide, Richard urged, scanning the area for a safe spot. Ahead, he spotted an old abandoned cabin, its windows dark and foreboding. It was a risk, but they didn't have many options left. Over there, Richard pointed toward the cabin, and Zoe nodded, following closely behind him as they made their way toward it. The door creaked open as Richard pushed it, the wood aged and warped. He peered inside, his heart racing. It looked empty, but they couldn't afford to be careless. They slipped inside, Richard closing the door behind them and pressing his back against it, straining to listen for the sounds of their pursuers. Inside, the cabin was dim and dusty, remnants of furniture scattered throughout a long abandoned relic of a different time. Stay close, Richard whispered to Zoe, his heart racing as they moved deeper into the shadows. They crouched behind a rickety old table, holding their breath as the sounds of the men drew closer outside. Richard felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins, every nerve ending on high alert as he waited for what felt like an eternity. Did you see them? One of the men shouted outside, his voice tinged with frustration. Not yet, another man replied, but they can't have gone far. They're still in the woods. Richard's heart sank at the realization that they were still searching. He glanced down at Zoe, who was trembling beside him, her small frame hidden in the shadows. We're going to be okay, he whispered, trying to reassure both her and himself. But the dread settling in his stomach told him otherwise. The men were closing in, and their time was running out. As the voices outside continued to argue, Richard felt a sense of urgency gripping him. They couldn't stay here forever. They had to find a way out, had to find safety for Zoe. Suddenly, Richard heard footsteps approaching the cabin. His heart raced as he peered through a crack in the door, watching as one of the men approached. Let's check this cabin, the man said, his voice low and menacing. They might be hiding inside. Richard's pulse quickened. There was no way they could be discovered. They needed to act fast. We have to move, he whispered urgently to Zoe. We can't let them find us. Just as the man reached for the cabin door, Richard felt a surge of panic. Back, he whispered to Zoe, urging her further into the shadows as he prepared to face whatever came next. The door swung open and the man stepped inside, flashlight in hand, illuminating the dust and shadows of the cabin. Richard felt his breath hitch in his throat as he steeled himself, ready for a fight. Hello? The man called out, his voice echoing eerily in the silence. Richard could feel Zoe trembling beside him, her small hand gripping his tightly. Stay behind me, he whispered, positioning himself protectively in front of her. The man stepped further into the cabin, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I know you're in here, he taunted, a sinister grin spreading across his face. You can't hide forever. As the man moved closer, Richard felt his heart pounding in his chest, a mix of fear and determination coursing through him. He wouldn't let them take Zoe. Not now, not ever. In one swift motion, Richard lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. They wrestled for control, Richard's adrenaline fueling his strength, as he fought to keep the man from raising his weapon. Run, he yelled at Zoe, hoping she would understand. Get out of here. Zoe hesitated for a moment, fear etched on her face, but Richard's fierce determination spurred her into action. Go, Zoe. Now. With that, she turned and bolted toward the back of the cabin, slipping out into the night, as Richard continued to struggle with the man beneath him. Get off me, the man growled, shoving Richard back with surprising force. Richard stumbled, but quickly regained his footing, determined to keep fighting. He could hear the commotion outside, the shouts of the other men searching the woods, and he knew time was running out. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the cabin as another man burst in, joining the struggle. What are you doing? He shouted, drawing his weapon. Get him! Panic surged through Richard as he realized he was outnumbered. He had to think fast. With a burst of adrenaline, he kicked out, catching the first man in the stomach and sending him sprawling backward. Zoe, he shouted, hoping she could hear him. Where are you? But there was no time to search for her. He had to keep fighting. The second man lunged at him, and Richard barely dodged the blow, scrambling to regain his footing as the struggle continued. Outside, the sounds of chaos erupted, as the other men realized what was happening. Richard could hear them shouting, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush as they rushed toward the cabin. "Get him! Don't let him escape!" one of the men yelled, his voice echoing in the night. Richard's heart raced as he continued to fight, every muscle in his body straining against the weight of his opponents. He couldn't give up, not when Zoe was depending on him. With a sudden surge of energy, Richard pushed the man off him and darted toward the back of the cabin. "Zoe!" he yelled, desperately searching for her. He had to get to her before they found her. As he burst out the back door, he scanned the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. "Zoe!" His voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. Panic tightened in his chest as he raced around the cabin, searching for any sign of her. "Zoe? Where are you?" Just then, he caught sight of movement in the shadows, a small figure darting behind a tree. Richard's heart leapt with hope. "Zoe," he called again, rushing toward her. But just as he reached the tree, he heard the voices of the men closing in. "This way." They went this way. Richard's heart sank as he realized the men were almost upon them. "We have to go," he urged Zoe, grabbing her hand. "We can't stay here." They took off into the woods again, Richard pulling Zoe along as they sprinted through the underbrush. The darkness surrounded them, the sounds of the men pursuing them echoing in the night. "Daddy, I'm scared," Zoe cried, her breath coming in quick gasps. "I know, sweetheart. Just keep running," Richard urged, his heart racing as they pushed deeper into the trees. The sounds of their pursuers grew louder, a cacophony of shouts and crashing branches that sent fear spiraling through Richard's chest. He could feel the weight of despair settling over him. How long could they keep running? Where could they find safety in this vast dark forest? Suddenly, Richard spotted a glimmer of light through the trees, a small cabin perched on the edge of a clearing. "Over there," he shouted, pointing toward the light. "Is it safe?" Zoe asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but it's our best shot," Richard replied, urging her forward as they raced toward the cabin. As they approached, Richard noticed the faint glow of a lantern flickering in the window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Please, let there be someone inside," he thought as they reached the door. He knocked frantically, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. "Open up," he shouted, desperation lacing his voice. "Please, we need help." As the door creaked open, Richard's heart sank at the sight of an old man standing in the doorway, his face lined with age and suspicion. "What do you want?" the man asked, his voice gruff. "Please, we're being chased," Richard urged, glancing over his shoulder. The sounds of the men were growing closer. "We need a place to hide." The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he looked at them. "I don't want any trouble," he said, glancing nervously at the woods. "We're not here to cause trouble," Richard pleaded. "We just need a chance to escape." The old man sighed, glancing back toward the trees as the shouts grew louder. "Fine," he said reluctantly, stepping aside, "but you better not bring any trouble with you." "Thank you," Richard exclaimed, ushering Zoe inside. The old man closed the door behind them, and Richard quickly scanned the small cabin, searching for a place to hide. "Find somewhere to hide," Richard whispered urgently to Zoe. She nodded, darting toward a small alcove in the corner, filled with old blankets and supplies. Richard crouched down beside her, holding his breath as the sounds outside grew louder. "We'll be safe here," he promised, trying to quell the growing fear within him. But just as they settled in, the cabin door burst open, and the men stormed inside, their flashlights sweeping the room. "There they are," one of them shouted, pointing directly at Richard and Zoe. "Get them." In that moment, everything seemed to slow down, as Richard felt a surge of panic and adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wouldn't let them take his daughter. He couldn't. "Run, Zoe," he yelled, shoving her away from him as he lunged at the nearest man, tackling him to the ground. The two of them crashed against a wooden table, sending it toppling over, the noise echoing in the cabin. "Daddy?" Zoe cried, her voice filled with terror. "Go," Richard shouted, trying to keep the men at bay. He could feel the weight of despair bearing down on him, but he refused to give in. Zoe hesitated for just a moment, fear written all over her face. But then she turned and bolted for the back door of the cabin. Richard fought fiercely against the men, grappling with one as he tried to push past him. "Don't let them escape," one of the men yelled, and Richard could feel the weight of their determination pressing down on him. Just then, Richard heard Zoe's voice from outside, filled with panic. "Daddy, help!" The desperation in her voice sent a jolt of fear through Richard. He had to reach her, had to protect her no matter the cost. With a final burst of energy, Richard shoved the man away and dashed toward the back door, bursting out into the night just in time to see Zoe being grabbed by one of the men. "No!" Richard shouted, adrenaline surging through him as he lunged forward. He wouldn't let them take her. In that split second, everything hung in the balance, Richard's heart racing, his mind consumed with thoughts of saving his daughter. He could see the fear in Zoe's eyes, the terror as the man gripped her arm tightly. "Let her go," Richard roared, charging forward with everything he had. The man turned, surprise flashing across his face as Richard collided with him, both of them tumbling to the ground. Richard fought with every ounce of strength, desperation fueling his every move. He couldn't let them win, not now, not ever. The fight raged around him, a whirlwind of chaos and fear, but all that mattered was Zoe. "Run, Zoe! Get away!" Richard yelled, even as he wrestled with the man on the ground. But just as Zoe turned to flee, Richard felt a sharp pain slice through his side, a sudden jolt of agony that took his breath away. He gasped, realizing one of the other men had managed to get behind him. "Get off him!" Zoe screamed, her small voice breaking through the chaos as she tried to fight back. "No!" Richard shouted, his heart racing as he struggled against the pain. He couldn't let them take her. He wouldn't. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Richard pushed the man off him, turning just in time to see Zoe charging toward him. "Daddy?" she cried, her eyes wide with fear. "Zoe, get back!" he shouted, trying to protect her even as he staggered back, pain radiating through his body. But it was too late. The men were closing in, and Richard felt the weight of despair settling over him once again. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let them take Zoe. As the men advanced, Richard fought with everything he had left, every instinct screaming at him to protect his daughter. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let them take her away from him. But just as it seemed they might be overwhelmed, he caught sight of a glimmer of hope, a path leading deeper into the forest, a way to escape. "Zoe!" he shouted, urgency lacing his voice. "This way!" With a final surge of strength, he grabbed Zoe's hand and pulled her toward the path, urgency driving them forward as they darted into the darkness of the woods. "Run!" Richard urged, his heart pounding in his chest as they raced down the narrow trail. The sounds of their pursuers echoed behind them, but Richard was determined to find safety, determined to keep Zoe safe at all costs. As they ran, Richard's mind raced with thoughts of how to escape, how to keep Zoe safe from the men chasing them. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of danger pressing down on them as they pushed further into the forest. The sounds of the men behind them grew fainter, but Richard knew they wouldn't give up easily. He could still feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the fear and desperation propelling them forward as they ran deeper into the woods. Just as he thought they might have gained some distance, Richard spotted a clearing up ahead, a small cabin standing alone in the moonlight. Hope surged within him as they approached. "There!" he shouted, pointing toward the cabin. "We can hide there." They rushed toward the door, Richard's heart pounding in his chest as he pushed it open and ushered Zoe inside. The interior was dark, shadows dancing on the walls, as Richard quickly scanned the room for any signs of danger. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Zoe, his voice low and urgent as they crept further into the cabin. But just as they began to settle in, they heard footsteps outside, heavy boots crunching on the leaves. Richard's heart sank as he exchanged a worried glance with Zoe. "Are they coming?" Zoe whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Richard replied, holding his breath as the footsteps grew closer. "We need to find somewhere to hide." He quickly led Zoe toward a small closet in the corner, gesturing for her to climb inside. "Stay quiet, okay?" he urged, watching as she nodded and squeezed in, her small frame disappearing into the darkness. Just as he was about to follow her, the cabin door burst open and the men stormed in, flashlights sweeping the room. "Check everywhere," one of them barked, their voices filled with malice. Richard's heart raced as he pressed himself against the wall, praying they wouldn't find Zoe. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of fear pressing down on him as he watched the men search through the cabin. Come on, Richard thought, desperation clawing at him. He couldn't let them find her. He wouldn't let them. As the men moved closer, Richard realized he had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and hope for the best. He needed a distraction. With a deep breath, he grabbed a nearby lamp and hurled it across the room, shattering it against the wall. The sound echoed loudly, drawing the men's attention away from the closet. "What was that?" one of them shouted, rushing toward the noise. "Let's check it out," another man replied, his voice laced with urgency. Richard seized the moment, slipping quietly toward the closet. "Zoe, it's okay," he whispered, gently opening the door. "I'm scared, Daddy," she cried softly, her voice trembling. "Shh, we have to be quiet," he urged, quickly helping her out. "We have to find another way out." Just as they were about to move, Richard heard footsteps approaching again, closer this time. Panic surged within him as he glanced around the room for another escape route. "We need to hide," he whispered urgently, glancing toward the back window. It looked small, but it was their only chance. "Daddy?" Zoe whimpered, her eyes wide with fear. "Trust me," he said, his voice firm. "We can make it. Just follow my lead." Richard led her to the window, quickly pushing it open as quietly as possible. "You first," he instructed, helping Zoe climb through the small opening. "Now you, Daddy," she urged, reaching back to him. "I'm right behind you," he promised, scrambling through the window just as he heard the men returning. They landed softly on the ground outside, the cool air wrapping around them like a cloak. Richard glanced around, his heart pounding as he scanned the area for any signs of danger. "Come on, we have to move," he urged, pulling Zoe along as they darted into the trees once more. They ran through the forest, branches whipping at their faces, the darkness enveloping them as they searched for safety. But Richard knew they couldn't run forever. The men were relentless, and he could feel the weight of exhaustion creeping in as they pushed deeper into the woods. "We need to find somewhere to hide," he said, glancing around frantically. Just then, he spotted a small cave nestled between rocks. "There," he pointed, leading Zoe toward it. As they entered the cave, Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was dark and cool, a hidden refuge away from the chaos outside. "Stay close," he whispered to Zoe, watching as she huddled against wall, her small body shaking with fear. "We'll be safe here," Richard promised, settling in beside her. The darkness wrapped around them like a protective blanket as they listened to the sounds of the forest outside. Minutes turned into hours as they huddled together, Richard's mind racing with thoughts of how to escape. He couldn't let them find them. He wouldn't let them take Zoe away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sounds of the men began to fade. Richard's heart still raced, but he felt a glimmer of hope. "Do you think they're gone?" Zoe asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope so," Richard replied, glancing toward the cave entrance. "But we can't take any chances. We have to be careful." As they settled in for the night, Richard held Zoe close, determined to keep her safe at all costs. They might be trapped in the darkness, but together they would find a way to escape. The next morning, Richard awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside, sunlight filtering through trees. He stretched out, feeling weight of exhaustion still clinging to him. "Zoe," he whispered, gently shaking her awake. "It's time to go." She blinked sleepily at him, her eyes wide with confusion. "Are they gone?" "I think so," Richard replied, glancing toward the cave entrance. "But we need to be quick. We can't stay here much longer." They crawled out of the cave, and Richard took a deep breath, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The forest was quiet, but he could still feel the tension lingering in the air. "Let's stick to the trees," he said, motioning for Zoe to follow him, as they began to make their way through the underbrush. As they moved cautiously through the woods, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. His heart raced as they pushed forward, determined to find safety. But just as they rounded a bend in the path, Richard froze, his heart sinking as he spotted the men ahead of them, gathered in a small clearing. "Quick, hide," he whispered, pulling Zoe behind a large tree just in time. "What do we do?" Zoe whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay quiet," Richard instructed, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. He watched as the men laughed and joked among themselves, their faces twisted with malice. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he considered their options. "We can't go back. We have to find another way," he whispered to Zoe, glancing around for any possible escape route. "Over there." Zoe pointed to a narrow path that wound deeper into the forest, away from the men. "Good eye," Richard replied, leading her quietly along the path. They moved quickly but carefully, the sounds of the men fading behind them. As they navigated through the dense trees, Richard's mind raced with thoughts of how to escape. They had to find someone who could protect them. Suddenly, he caught sight of a dirt road in the distance. "Zoe, look," he pointed, his heart racing at the thought of reaching civilization. "Do you think it's safe?" Zoe asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but it's better than staying out here," Richard replied, pulling her along as they sprinted toward the road. Just as they reached the edge of the trees, Richard spotted a car approaching in the distance. Hope surged within him as he raised his arm, waving frantically. "Stop, please," he shouted, desperation lacing his voice. The car slowed, and Richard could see a concerned face behind the wheel. The driver stopped, rolling down the window. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice filled with worry. "We need help," Richard urged, glancing back toward the woods. "We're being chased. Get in," the woman said immediately, her eyes darting nervously toward the trees. Richard quickly opened the door and ushered Zoe inside, climbing in beside her as the woman started to drive away. "Thank you," he gasped, feeling the weight of fear lifting slightly as they sped down the road. "What happened?" the woman asked, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. "It's a long story," Richard replied, glancing back at the forest, fear still lingering in his chest. "But we're safe now." As they drove further away, Richard felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. They had escaped the immediate danger, but he knew the threat wasn't over. He had to protect Zoe always. "We're going to be okay," he reassured her, squeezing her hand tightly. "I was so scared, Daddy," Zoe whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "I know, sweetheart. But we're safe now, and I promise to keep you safe," Richard replied, determination flooding through him. They would find a way to heal, to overcome the darkness they had faced together. And as they continued down the road, Richard vowed to himself that he would never let anything come between him and his daughter again. They were a team, and together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, united by the bond of love and the promise of safety. As Richard and Zoe sped down the road, the world outside transformed into a blur of trees and sunlight. But inside, a storm of emotions brewed. Relief washed over Richard, but a nagging fear still clung to him. Who were those men? What did they want with his daughter? "Where are we going?" Zoe asked, her voice still shaky. "We're going to find a safe place, sweetheart," Richard replied, forcing a reassuring smile. "Somewhere we can breathe and think." The driver, a kind woman named Lisa, glanced back at them. "I can take you to my place. It's a small cabin not far from here. You can rest and gather your thoughts." "Thank you," Richard said, grateful for her kindness. "We really appreciate it." Lisa nodded, her expression serious. "I've seen my share of trouble in these woods. If you're being hunted, we need to be careful." As they arrived at Lisa's cabin, the surroundings felt serene, a stark contrast to the chaos Richard and Zoe had just escaped. The wooden structure nestled among tall pines appeared inviting, and the fresh air filled Richard's lungs with a sense of calm. "Let's get inside," Lisa urged, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting trouble. Richard sensed her unease, his own instincts on high alert. Once inside, Richard locked the door and led Zoe to the small living room. "You can rest here," he said, gesturing to a comfortable couch. "I'll find us something to eat." "I'm not hungry," Zoe replied, her eyes wide with lingering fear. Richard knelt beside her, brushing her hair back. "I know, but you need your strength. Just try to eat a little." As he prepared a quick meal in the kitchen, his mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking close by. After all, the men who had chased them were still out there, and he couldn't rest until he knew they were safe. While the pasta boiled, Richard's thoughts drifted back to the encounter in the woods. He had never seen those men before, yet their menacing presence haunted him. What had they wanted? And why had they pursued them so relentlessly? The sound of Zoe's soft footsteps brought him back to reality. She stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the sunlight. "Daddy, do you think they'll find us?" Richard sighed, kneeling down to her level. "I don't know, honey. But we're safe for now. I promise I won't let anything happen to you." "Promise?" Zoe asked, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "Promise," he said firmly. And at that moment, Richard felt an overwhelming determination. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe. After they finished eating, Richard decided they needed a plan. "We can't just wait here. I need to figure out who those men are and why they were after us. I'll go into town and see if I can find any answers." Zoe's eyes widened. "But what if they're there, Daddy?" "I'll be careful. I'll keep my head down, and I won't draw attention to myself," he promised. "You'll stay here with Lisa, okay? She'll take care of you. Will you come back?" Zoe asked, her voice trembling. "I'll be back before you know it," Richard reassured her, kissing her forehead. "Stay close to Lisa and stay inside." As Richard prepared to leave, Lisa joined him at the door. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "It could be dangerous. I have to know who they are." "I can't just hide away and hope for the best," Richard replied. "Okay, just be careful," she said, and Richard nodded, stepping out into the fading daylight. The drive into town felt surreal. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. Richard's heart raced as he approached the main street, scanning the area for any signs of danger. He parked the car a few blocks away and made his way toward a small diner he remembered from his previous visits. As he entered, the bell chimed above the door, and the familiar smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. The patrons glanced up, but Richard quickly focused on the counter, where an older man, Jake, sat reading the newspaper. "Richard?" Jake exclaimed, his face lighting up. "Haven't seen you in a while. What brings you here?" "Jake, I need your help," Richard said, his voice low. "Have you seen any men around here? They were chasing me and my daughter." Jake's expression shifted to concern. "What do they look like?" Richard quickly described the men, detailing their rugged appearance and the menacing aura that surrounded them. Jake frowned, his brow furrowing. "I've seen a couple of guys fitting that description. They've been asking questions about a little girl." "Zoe?" Richard asked, panic rising in his chest. "Yeah, I think so. They were asking about her at the gas station a few days ago," Jake replied. "Said something about a family connection." "What do you mean?" Richard pressed, his heart pounding. "I don't know all the details, but I overheard them talking about some kind of inheritance," Jake said, his voice low. "Something tied to a family estate. That girl must be involved somehow." Richard felt his stomach drop. An inheritance? But from whom? Zoe's mother had passed away, and they had no family to speak of. "What do I do?" Richard asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "Get back to that cabin and stay alert," Jake advised. "I'll spread the word and see if I can find out more." "Thanks, Jake," Richard said, relief flooding through him. He hurried out of the diner, anxiety propelling him back toward the car. Once he reached the cabin, he burst through the door, breathless. "Zoe! Lisa!" Zoe emerged from the bedroom, her face lighting up. "Daddy, is everything okay?" Richard asked, his eyes darting around the room. "Yeah, we were just reading a story," Zoe replied. "Good. We need to talk." Richard quickly filled them in on what he had learned about the men and the possible connection to an inheritance. "I don't understand," Zoe said, confusion clouding her expression. "What inheritance?" "Something that may have belonged to your mother," Richard explained carefully, trying to shield her from the darker implications. "We need to be ready for anything. Do you think they're coming after me?" Zoe asked, her voice small. Richard knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "I don't know, but we're going to be ready. I promise I won't let anything happen to you." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced the cabin, his mind racing with thoughts of Zoe's mother, the past they shared, and the unknown dangers lurking outside. Just as dawn began to break, he heard a noise outside, a rustling in the bushes. His heart dropped, and he quickly moved to the window, peering through the curtains. A figure emerged from the tree line, and Richard's breath caught in his throat. It was one of the men. "Zoe, get down," he hissed, grabbing her and pulling her to the floor. "Daddy?" she cried, panic rising in her voice. "Stay quiet," he urged, his heart racing as he watched man approach cabin. The door swung open with a creak, and Richard's pulse quickened. The intruder stepped inside, flashlight in hand, scanning the room. "Zoe, stay behind me," Richard whispered, positioning himself between her and the man. "Where is she?" The man growled, his voice dripping with malice. "You can't keep her hidden forever." "Who are you?" Richard demanded, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Just a friend of the family," the man sneered. "Your daughter has something that belongs to us." "I'm not giving her to you," Richard said firmly, his heart pounding. The tension in the room crackled as man stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You don't understand. If you don't hand her over, there will be consequences." Richard's mind raced as he weighed his options. "What do you want with her?" "She's part of something much bigger than you can imagine," man replied, a twisted smile on his lips. "An inheritance that could change everything." "I don't care about any inheritance," Richard shot back, anger rising within him. "I just want my daughter to be safe." "You're making a mistake," man warned, taking another step forward. Just then, Richard heard the sound of a car approaching outside. Relief surged through him. "We're not afraid of you," Richard said, trying to sound brave. The man's eyes flickered with uncertainty as he glanced toward window. In that instant, Richard lunged forward, tackling intruder to ground. "Zoe, run," he shouted, adrenaline surging through him as they struggled. The man was strong, but Richard fought with every ounce of strength he had, desperate to protect his daughter. Zoe dashed toward the door, and just as she reached it, the sound of tires screeching filled the air. Richard's heart raced as he pinned man down, his fists flying in a flurry of desperation. Suddenly, the door burst open and Lisa rushed in, a look of horror on her face. "What's going on? Get Zoe out of here!" Richard yelled, grappling with the man beneath him. "I called for backup," Lisa shouted, brandishing a weapon. "You need to get out now." Richard felt a surge of hope as he finally managed to get the upper hand, pinning man's arms down. "Who are you?" he demanded, breathless. "I told you, just a friend," the man spat. "But you'll regret this." Before Richard could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air outside. The man's eyes widened in realization, and with a sudden burst of strength, he kicked Richard off him and scrambled to his feet. "Get out!" Lisa shouted, her weapon trained on the intruder. But he was too quick. He dashed toward the window, leaping through the open frame just as the police arrived. Richard scrambled to his feet, panic surging through him as he turned to Zoe. "Are you okay?" he asked, heart pounding in his chest. "I'm scared, Daddy," she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know, but we're safe now," Richard promised, wrapping her in a protective embrace. The police officers stormed in, guns drawn. "Hands up! Show us your hands!" They shouted, but Richard's focus remained on Zoe. "Stay close," he said, holding her tightly as the officers began to secure the cabin. "What happened here?" one officer asked, looking at Richard with concern. "Those men were after my daughter," Richard replied, still reeling from the intensity of the confrontation. "Did you get a look at them?" another officer asked, his expression serious. "Just one." "He said something about an inheritance," Richard said, confusion still swirling in his mind. "I need to know what that means." The officers exchanged glances. "We'll investigate," one said, pulling out a notebook. As the officers began their work, Richard took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He had faced danger, but Zoe was safe, and that was all that mattered. Just then, Lisa approached Richard, her expression grim. "I need to talk to you." "What is it?" Richard asked, worry creeping into his voice. "I've been doing some digging," Lisa said, lowering her voice. "The men you encountered, they're not just random thugs. They're part of a larger organization that's been looking for your daughter for years." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, his pulse quickening. "They're after a trust fund," Lisa explained. "Zoe's mother had ties to a wealthy family, and there's a significant sum of money tied to her name." Richard felt his heart drop. "But why didn't I know about any of this?" "It's possible your wife didn't want you to get involved in that world," Lisa said gently. "But now that they know about Zoe, they'll stop at nothing to get to her." "What do I do?" Richard asked, feeling overwhelmed. "We need to make sure she's protected," Lisa replied, determination shining in her eyes. "I have contacts who can help. We'll figure this out together." As the officers wrapped up their investigation, Richard felt a sense of resolve wash over him. He wouldn't let anyone take Zoe away from him. They were a family, and he would do everything in his power to keep her safe. But just as he was about to voice his determination, a familiar figure stepped through the door. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the face he hadn't seen in years. "Surprise," the woman said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did you miss me, Richard?" "Emily?" Richard said, shock coursing through him. "What are you doing here?" "I heard you were in trouble, and I couldn't resist," Emily replied, her expression a mix of amusement and annoyance. "You always did know how to find trouble." "I don't have time for this," Richard said, frustration boiling over. "I need to protect my daughter." Emily stepped closer, her expression suddenly serious. "That's exactly why I'm here. I know more about this inheritance than you realize, and I can help." Richard's heart raced as he faced Emily, torn between disbelief and the desperate need for answers. "What do you know?" "I know where the money is," she said, her voice low. "And I know how to keep Zoe safe from those men." Richard's mind spun. "You want something in return?" Emily smirked. "Let's just say, I've always had a vested interest in the family fortune." Before he could respond, Lisa interjected. "We don't have time for this, Emily. We need to focus on getting Zoe out of here." But Richard felt a flicker of hope. If Emily was telling the truth, she might hold the key to their safety. "I need to know everything," he said, meeting her gaze. "Fine," she replied, crossing her arms. "Meet me at the old estate tonight. I'll give you the details you need." "I don't trust you," Richard said, skepticism gnawing at him. "Trust me or not, but this is your best shot," Emily shot back, a hard edge in her voice. "If you want to protect Zoe, you need to act fast." As Emily turned to leave, Richard felt a storm of emotions swirling within him. He knew he had to protect Zoe, but the thought of walking into a trap left him uneasy. Yet something in Emily's eyes suggested she was serious. "Richard, we need to make a decision," Lisa said, her voice urgent. Richard glanced at Zoe, who clung to his side, her eyes wide with confusion. "We'll go to the estate," he said finally, determination flooding his voice. "I need to know what we're up against." As night fell, Richard, Zoe, and Lisa drove toward the old estate, the shadows of the past looming large over them. The wind howled through the trees, sending chills down Richard's spine. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't abandon Zoe. They arrived at the estate, a grand but decaying mansion surrounded by overgrown gardens. Richard's heart raced as he stepped out of the car, the tension palpable in the air. "Stay close," he instructed Zoe, who nodded, her small hand clutching his tightly. They approached the front door, and Richard hesitated for a moment. "What if this is a trap? Then we'll deal with it," Lisa said firmly. "But we need answers." Richard took a deep breath and pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit foyer adorned with dust-covered furniture and faded portraits. Emily stood at the end of the hall, a shadowy figure amidst the gloom. "Glad you could make it," she said, her voice echoing off the walls. "We don't have much time." "What do you know?" Richard pressed, his voice tense. Emily gestured for them to follow her into a larger room filled with cobwebs and old memories. "The inheritance is tied to an old family secret," she began. "Zoe's mother had a right to a substantial trust fund that could ensure her safety, but it's been hidden for years." "Hidden? Why?" Richard asked, confusion and anger boiling inside him. "Because of the men after you," Emily replied, her voice steady. "They want the trust for themselves, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." "What do we do?" Richard asked, desperation clawing at his throat. Emily hesitated, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "We need to find the trust documents. They're hidden in the mansion somewhere, and once we have them, we can protect Zoe." "Let's split up," Lisa suggested. "We can cover more ground that way." "No," Richard said, shaking his head. "We stick together. I won't take any chances with Zoe here." As they searched the mansion, Richard felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. The memories flooded back his life with Zoe's mother, the love they shared, and the secrets she had kept. "What are we looking for?" Zoe asked, her small voice breaking the silence. "Just some papers, honey. Something that will keep you safe," Richard reassured her, forcing a smile. But as they moved deeper into the mansion, an unsettling feeling began to creep over Richard. The walls felt alive, whispering secrets he wasn't ready to confront. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, Lisa stopped. "I think I found something," she called, excitement bubbling in her voice. Richard rushed to her side, his heart racing. She stood before a large, ornate cabinet, her fingers tracing over the intricate carvings. "It looks like it's locked," she said, glancing at Richard. "Let me try," Richard said, stepping forward. He examined the cabinet, looking for any sign of a mechanism to open it. Just as he was about to push on a carved panel, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. "Someone's coming," Emily hissed, panic flickering in her eyes. "Get Zoe out of here," Richard ordered, heart pounding. But before he could finish, the door slammed open, and the men from earlier poured into the room, their faces twisted with malice. "Look who we found," one of them sneered. "You've been quite the nuisance." "Get away from us," Richard shouted, stepping protectively in front of Zoe. "Your little girl doesn't belong to you," the leader taunted. "She's a key to something much bigger." Richard's blood ran cold as he felt Zoe trembling beside him. "Stay behind me," he whispered, trying to shield her from the danger. "Why don't you just hand her over, and we'll make this easy?" The leader continued, his voice smooth as silk. "You have no idea what you're up against." "No," Richard yelled, anger surging through him. "I'll never let you take her." A tense standoff ensued, the air thick with impending violence. Richard's heart raced as he searched for a way out, but the men had them cornered. "Get the documents," the leader commanded his men, their eyes narrowing as they approached the cabinet. In that moment, Richard felt a surge of desperation. He couldn't let them get to Zoe. "Run!" he shouted at Lisa and Zoe, shoving them toward the door. "Richard!" Lisa cried, but he was already lunging at the nearest man, determined to fight. The room erupted into chaos as Richard tackled the man, fists flying. The others swarmed, but adrenaline coursed through him, fueling his determination. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let them take Zoe. Amidst the struggle, He caught a glimpse of Lisa dragging Zoe out the door, and his heart swelled with relief. They were safe for now. As he fought, Richard felt a deep sense of purpose. Memories of his family flashed before his eyes, the laughter, the love, the bond he would do anything to protect. With renewed strength, he broke free from his attacker, pushing him aside and dashing toward the cabinet. "Where are the documents?" he yelled, desperation rising within him. "I won't tell you." The leader spat, lunging forward. But just as he reached Richard, the cabinet door swung open, revealing a hidden compartment filled with papers and an old, ornate box. Richard grabbed the box, clutching it to his chest. "Get back," he shouted, defiance in his voice. "You'll never have her." But the leader's eyes gleamed with something Richard hadn't anticipated. "You think you've won? This isn't over yet." Richard didn't have time to process his words before the room shook with the sound of sirens approaching. The men exchanged nervous glances, their confidence faltering. "Let's go," the leader shouted, motioning for his men to retreat. But Richard wasn't going to let them get away. He sprinted after them, adrenaline fueling his every step. Just as they reached the door, he tackled the leader, pinning him to the ground. "Tell me what you know," Richard shouted, his voice raw with anger. The man laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down Richard's spine. "You really don't know, do you? This isn't about the money, it's about power." Before Richard could respond, the leader grinned and whispered, "And you've just become part of it." Suddenly, a flash of light blinded Richard as the police stormed into the room, guns raised. "Hands up! Get on the ground!" The men scrambled for the exit, but Richard held onto the leader tightly. "You're not going anywhere." "Richard," Lisa shouted, pulling Zoe closer. "We're safe. The police are here." But as the chaos unfolded, Richard felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. The leader glanced at Richard, a wicked smile crossing his face. "You have no idea what you're getting into." With that, he slipped free from Richard's grip, vanishing into the shadows just as the police closed in. Richard collapsed to the floor, panting heavily. The police officers quickly secured the area, and Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him. Zoe was safe. They had made it through the worst of it. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked, kneeling beside him, concern etched on her face. "I will be," Richard replied, still catching his breath. "But I need answers." "What does he mean?" As the officers began to question him, Richard's mind raced. The leader's words echoed in his ears. This wasn't over. "What do you know?" Richard demanded, frustration boiling over. Emily took a deep breath, her expression serious. "The trust isn't just a sum of money. It's tied to a powerful network. They're after Zoe for more than just the inheritance. They want control." "Control?" Richard echoed, confusion clouding his mind. "Yes," Emily said, her voice low. "They believe she's the key to unlocking a hidden legacy. Something much larger than just money. They'll stop at nothing to get it." Richard's heart raced as he absorbed her words. "But why didn't you tell me before?" "I didn't know how," Emily admitted, her eyes softening. "I thought I could keep you both safe. But now they know Zoe's name, and they'll come after her again. What do we do?" Richard asked, fear clawing at his throat. "We need to expose them," Emily replied, determination igniting in her voice. "I have contacts who can help. We can bring this organization down." Richard exchanged a glance with Lisa, who nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll do whatever it takes to keep Zoe safe." As they gathered their thoughts, a final twist of fate unfolded. Richard pulled out the ornate box from the cabinet, the air heavy with anticipation. "What's in here?" he wondered aloud. Emily's eyes widened. "I don't know, but it could hold the answers we need." Richard opened the box, and inside, they found a collection of documents, photographs, and a small key. "This is it," Emily breathed, her voice filled with awe. "This could be the proof we need to take them down." "But what's the key for?" Richard asked, his curiosity piqued. Emily examined the documents, her brow furrowing. "It could lead us to the original trust documents. We need to find out where this key unlocks." As they pieced together the information, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. This battle wasn't over, but they had the upper hand. They would expose the truth and protect Zoe, no matter what it took. But just as hope began to rise, Richard felt a sudden chill in the air. The shadows shifted, and he glanced out the window, spotting a familiar figure lurking in the darkness. "Richard?" Lisa's voice pulled him back to reality. "Did you see that?" he whispered, heart racing. "What?" Lisa asked, glancing outside. Richard turned back to Emily, his voice tense. "I think we have a bigger problem than we realized." Just then, The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Richard's instincts kicked in, and he reached for Zoe, pulling her close. "Stay down." Panic erupted as the door swung open, and the men returned, armed and ready for a fight. "This isn't over, Richard," the leader sneered, stepping forward. "You've made a grave mistake." Richard's heart pounded as he faced the growing threat. They had fought so hard to protect Zoe, but now they were surrounded. "Get out!" Richard yelled, adrenaline surging through him. But the leader only laughed, a dark sound that sent chills down Richard's spine. "You're in over your head." The tension was palpable as Richard braced for the impending confrontation. He couldn't let them take Zoe. He had to protect her at all costs. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the mansion, drawing everyone's attention. Richard's heart raced as he realized the police were still outside, coordinating their response. In that moment of distraction, Richard lunged at the leader, grappling for control. The room erupted into chaos, and time slowed as he fought for his daughter's safety. As the struggle unfolded, Richard's mind raced with thoughts of Zoe and the life they had built together. He couldn't let anyone take that away from him. With a final burst of strength, he overpowered the leader, pinning him to the ground. "You'll never hurt her," Richard shouted, rage and determination igniting his every move. The police stormed in, just as Richard secured the leader. Officers tackled the remaining men, swiftly apprehending them. Richard felt a rush of relief as the threat subsided, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked, rushing to his side. Richard nodded, still panting from the adrenaline. "Zoe? She's safe," Lisa reassured him. "We did it." But as the dust settled, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that their fight wasn't truly over. The leader's words echoed in his mind, a lingering threat that left him on edge. Suddenly, Emily approached, her expression grave. "We need to talk." "What is it?" Richard asked, concern gnawing at him. "I've been doing some digging," she began, her tone serious. "There's more to this than we thought. The organization is much larger, and they have eyes everywhere." "Why didn't you tell me before?" Richard demanded, frustration bubbling over. "I didn't want to scare you," Emily replied, her gaze unwavering. "But now that they know Zoe's name, we're in greater danger than ever." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "What do we do?"